Most people think closure is something we're owed, some final conversation, some tidy explanation, some gesture that makes everything make sense. But that belief alone is what traps you in powerlessness, because as long as you're waiting for someone else to give you closure, you've already handed them your peace. And ironically, the moment you stop seeking closure from the person who hurt you is the exact moment they begin to feel your absence in ways they never expected. That's where your power is. When a woman becomes her own closure, she becomes a force that a man can't control, and often one he can't forget. Think about this psychologically. The human brain seeks resolution. It's hardwired for narrative completion. When a relationship ends ambiguously without answers or emotional resolution, we want to chase clarity. We imagine that if we just had that one last talk, we'd feel better. But clarity doesn't come from the other person. It comes from confronting your own desire for understanding and choosing to move forward despite not having it. A woman who does this, who stops reaching for answers outside herself and instead takes responsibility for her emotional architecture, becomes radically attractive, not in the shallow sense of appearance, but in a deeper existential sense. She is centered. She is solid. She is not emotionally dependent on another person's decisions. And this sends a powerful signal, especially to a man who thought she'd always be there, waiting. Men often don't realize what they had until it becomes entirely inaccessible. And I don't just mean physically unavailable. I mean emotionally, spiritually, energetically removed. A woman who once needed answers, once needed his presence to feel whole, now stands on her own emotional legs. And men feel that deeply. It challenges their ego and their assumptions. It disrupts their psychological patterns. And often it compels them to return, not because you manipulated them into doing so, but because your absence did what your presence couldn't. This is not about playing games. It's about reclaiming dignity. It's about recognizing that begging for explanations or longing for closure becomes a performance of lack, and people sense that, especially men. A woman who needs closure still revolves around his gravity, but a woman who creates closure has built her own orbit. There's also a philosophical truth here. When we stop clinging to the idea that someone else has to complete our narrative, we grow. We evolve past the immature belief that healing is something given to us. Real closure is self-admitted. It is an act of internal rebellion against emotional dependence. And in that rebellion, there is freedom. Now here's the irony. The very thing that makes a man feel like he can leave, your willingness to chase or explain, is the same thing that makes him feel he doesn't need to return. But when that behavior disappears, when he senses that he's not being waited for, not being obsessed over, not being idolized, something starts to shift. His certainty crumbles, his ego is rattled, and the silence that used to feel like control becomes a mirror he can't ignore. You see, men return not to the woman who begged, not to the woman who waited. They return to the woman who rose. So don't wait for a man to tell you why he left. Show yourself why he was never your piece to begin with. Because when you stop seeking closure, you become it. And that kind of emotional self-possession, that's what lingers. That's what haunts. And in many cases, that's what brings him back. But by the time he does, if you've truly built your own peace, you may realize he was never worthy of the return. One of the most misunderstood dynamics in male psychology is the effect of feminine indifference. Not the kind that's cold, bitter, or passive-aggressive, but the kind that's born of self-respect. When a woman emotionally detaches from a man who's been playing games, something profound begins to happen. It's as if the equilibrium shifts. The game stops being fun for him. The power dynamic collapses. Because a man only continues the game when he believes you're still playing. But when you stop reacting, not in an effort to manipulate, but because you've elevated your standards, he loses his sense of control. And in that loss, he starts to feel something he may not have felt for a long time: desire. See, male desire is not rooted in comfort. It's rooted in challenge, in mystery, in the sense that something valuable might be lost. And when you remove yourself from the equation, not physically necessarily, but emotionally, he starts to encounter a psychological gap, a void. And the masculine psyche hates a void. It needs to resolve it. It needs to pursue what has slipped from its grip. This doesn't mean withholding affection or faking disinterest. That's superficial and frankly transparent. Men can sense when you're pretending to be detached while still craving their validation. No, this kind of indifference must be real. It must be rooted in a deep internal shift. A realization that your value isn't tied to his attention, that your worth isn't measured by whether he chooses you. And that's where the paradox lives, because the moment you stop needing him is often the moment he starts needing you. When he senses that your self-worth isn't contingent on his presence, you become rare, you become unpredictable. And in a world where men are constantly fed a sense of availability through texts, social media, and attention, true emotional unavailability becomes magnetic. Philosophically, this aligns with the idea that attachment breeds suffering. When we attach our sense of identity to the outcome of a relationship, we become reactive. We dance to the rhythm of someone else's whims. But when we release attachment, not in bitterness, but in clarity, we regain our center. We stop chasing. And it's in that moment of stillness that the other begins to chase. This is not about playing hard to get, it's about being hard to forget. And those are two entirely different realities. Playing hard to get is performative. It's based on fear of being too available. But being hard to forget is authentic. It's the natural consequence of living with such integrity that your absence speaks louder than your words ever could. A man might be entertained by a woman who tries to win him, but he's haunted by the woman who refuses to compete, the one who, rather than begging for attention, walks away with quiet confidence. That is the woman he replays in his mind. That is the woman who disrupts his comfort, and that disruption is what makes her unforgettable. And here's the psychological kicker. The brain is wired to seek resolution. When a man senses that he no longer has access to you, not just physically, but emotionally, his mind begins to loop. He re-examines, reimagines, reevaluates, and often he returns, not because you begged, but because you didn't. So if you want to shift the power in any dynamic where games are being played, don't try harder. Don't plead, prove, or persuade. Step back, detach, let your silence say what words never could. Because nothing is more disarming to a man who plays games than a woman who's no longer interested in playing. Be the one who walks not to provoke a reaction, but because peace is more valuable than validation. Philosophically, this aligns with the idea that attachment breeds suffering. When we attach our sense of identity to the outcome of a relationship, we become reactive. We dance to the rhythm of someone else's whims. But when we release attachment, not in bitterness, but in clarity, we regain our center. We stop chasing. And it's in that moment of stillness that the other begins to chase. This is not about playing hard to get. It's about being hard to forget. And those are two entirely different realities. Playing hard to get is performative. It's based on fear of being too available. But being hard to forget is authentic. It's the natural consequence of living with such integrity that your absence speaks louder than your words ever could. A man might be entertained by a woman who tries to win him, but he's haunted by the woman who refuses to compete. The one who, rather than begging for attention, walks away with quiet confidence. That is the woman he replays in his mind. That is the woman who disrupts his comfort. And that disruption is what makes her unforgettable. And here's the psychological kicker. The brain is wired to seek resolution. When a man senses that he no longer has access to you, not just physically, but emotionally, his mind begins to loop. He re-examines, reimagines, reevaluates. And often he returns, not because you begged, but because you didn't. So if you want to shift the power in any dynamic where games are being played, don't try harder. Don't plead, prove, or persuade. Step back, detach. Let your silence say what words never could, because nothing is more disarming to a man who plays games than a woman who's no longer interested in playing. Be the one who walks, not to provoke a reaction, but because peace is more valuable than validation. When you stop negotiating your worth, everything changes. And I don't just mean in romantic dynamics. I mean in the way the world starts to respond to you as a whole. One of the most psychologically damaging patterns I see, particularly in relationships, is the tendency to barter self-respect in exchange for fleeting affection or uncertain attachment. It's subtle and often unconscious. A woman might not say, "I'll accept less love if it means you won't leave," but she behaves as if that were the contract. And make no mistake, men read that. You see, people don't treat you based on who they are. They treat you based on who you are in their presence. If you constantly communicate through your actions or your silence that your boundaries are negotiable, that your standards bend when desire enters the room, then you invite a certain kind of treatment, not because you're unworthy, but because you've trained someone to believe that their inconsistency has no cost. Now, think about what happens when you reverse that. When you stand in your full value, not with aggression, but with clarity, there's a fundamental psychological principle at play here. Scarcity increases value, not manipulation. Scarcity of self-abandonment. When a man realizes you won't shrink to keep him, that you won't suppress your needs for his comfort, that you won't dilute your voice to avoid his disapproval, he is forced to see you not as a mirror of his ego, but as a sovereign individual. That's what it does. This shift does something remarkable. It reframes the entire dynamic. Because if a man is still testing, still playing games, still oscillating between presence and distance, he's no longer doing it from a place of power. He's now facing the weight of your self-possession. And that weight has gravity. It draws in men who are ready to rise and repels those who aren't. There's a philosophical truth here as well, one rooted in responsibility. When you stop negotiating your worth, you stop outsourcing your sense of self. You stop expecting someone else to decide if you're lovable, desirable, enough. You take that power back. And paradoxically, that very act makes you far more magnetic. Because nothing is more attractive, more stabilizing than someone who is whole without you. It's important to understand this isn't about ultimatums or emotional withholding. It's about alignment. If a relationship, romantic or otherwise, requires you to compromise your core values just to maintain connection, then what you're maintaining isn't love, it's dependency. And dependency masquerading as devotion is one of the most common traps that women fall into when trying to keep a man. And here's the deeper insight. When you let go of that fear, the fear that if you don't bend, he'll break away, you create room for the truth. And the truth is this: the right man, the mature man, the man who is actually capable of love, wants to meet a woman with standards, not as a threat, but as a mirror of what's possible. You give him something to rise to, and you filter out those who never intended to rise in the first place. So ask yourself, where have I been negotiating with someone who hasn't even met my terms halfway? Where have I been offering discounts on my dignity in the hopes of keeping connection alive? Because here's the paradox that can transform your relationships. When you stopped trying to prove your worth, others are finally forced to recognize it. And the ones who truly see it, they don't play games, they rise. The moment you stop bargaining with your value is the moment you begin attracting people who know better than to ask you to. It's one of the most overlooked truths in human relationships. The ability to walk away is not the end of connection. It's the foundation of genuine respect. See, many people operate under the illusion that constant availability, emotional overextension, or self-sacrifice is the glue that holds love together. But psychologically and philosophically, it's actually the opposite. True connection is forged in freedom, not desperation. And if you cannot walk away from something that is misaligned with your core values, then you're not in love. you're in bondage. I think about what this means for a man. When a woman demonstrates that she's not tethered by fear, that she's not emotionally enslaved by the outcome of a single relationship, she instantly commands a different kind of attention. Not from a place of superiority or ego, but from a place of inner structure. That structure, the ability to say, this doesn't work for me and I will not remain here out of fear, that's rare. That's what wakes people up. Men, whether consciously or not, test for this, especially men who are uncertain, insecure, or addicted to control. They push, they pull, they withdraw, they return, not necessarily because they're malicious, but because they're trying to see what holds. Will she chase me if I disappear? Will she fight for me if I act disinterested? Will she change herself to keep me? And the answer you give in those moments doesn't come through your words. It comes through your willingness or your unwillingness to remain where you are, not fully valued. Now, here's where this goes even deeper. If you don't have the strength to walk away, you're not actually giving the man a choice. You've made the decision for him. You've said, no matter how you treat me, I'm staying. And that eliminates all possibility for real transformation. People change most often not because you tell them to, but because they face the consequences of staying the same. In other words, when you demonstrate that you are not afraid to lose someone, you paradoxically become someone they are far less willing to lose. There's something profoundly transformative that happens when a woman stops waiting to be chosen and begins to choose herself. And I don't mean this in some superficial self-help cliche way. I'm talking about a deep psychological shift, one that alters her very orientation to love, to connection, to power. Because the woman who no longer anxiously awaits validation, approval, or attention from a man, that woman becomes the gravity in the room. She doesn't chase, she doesn't over-explain, she doesn't perform emotional gymnastics to keep someone interested. She simply exists in the fullness of her own being. And that changes everything. Now, let's look at this through the lens of male psychology. When a man encounters a woman who is self-sourced, who draws her identity not from how well she's loved, but from how well she lives, he either rises to meet her or he quietly drifts away. And both outcomes are a win for her. That's the brilliance of it. Because she's no longer auditioning for a role in his life. She's building her own. She's busy constructing a world so rich, so meaningful, that he either brings value to it or he doesn't belong in it. This kind of self-containment is magnetic, not because it manipulates, but because it reveals contrast. In a world where so many are anxiously clinging, second-guessing, compromising themselves to fit into someone else's life, she's doing the opposite. She's rooted. And a rooted person, psychologically speaking, sends a very different signal. It says, I know who I am, with or without you. That kind of clarity is unnerving for someone who's used to playing games, who's used to testing limits to see how far they can push. But for the man who's ready, who's seeking depth, who's looking for something real, it's the lighthouse in a storm. And it's important to note, this isn't about being cold or detached or guarded. That's a trauma response masquerading as strength. No, this is about wholeness. It's about a woman who is emotionally available, capable of intimacy, capable of vulnerability, but also unwilling to betray herself in the process. She'll open her heart, yes, but she won't abandon her soul. Now, here's where this gets interesting. When a man realizes that he's with someone who doesn't need him, but genuinely wants him, the dynamics shift dramatically. He's not being tolerated, he's being chosen, freely, consciously, and with intention. That's not just flattering, it's rare, and rare things are valued. That's the psychological truth of it. We value what we perceive as scarce, and a woman who lives her life not in pursuit of someone else's affection, but in pursuit of truth, meaning, and alignment. That's a scarcity in the modern dating world. And when you become the scarcity, you stop chasing and start attracting. There is a quiet power in being okay without someone, in knowing that if they walk away, you won't collapse. You'll recalibrate, you'll reflect, you'll grieve if needed, but then you'll keep moving. That mindset liberates you from the emotional volatility of being at the mercy of someone else's attention span. It frees you to love from overflow, not emptiness. And ironically, that's when people tend to come back, not because you begged or convinced them, but because they could feel on a visceral level that your self-worth was never on the table to begin with. So if you really want to shift the dynamic with a man, don't just try to get him to return. Instead, return to yourself. Build a life that's so rich in purpose, connection, and joy that whether he comes back or not becomes irrelevant. And that irrelevance, not coldness, not indifference, but genuine internal peace is what often calls him back. Because men don't fall hardest for the woman who clings. They fall hardest for the woman who walks in wholeness. And here's the philosophical crux of it all. Love, in its highest form, cannot exist without the real possibility of loss. If there's no boundary, no capacity to leave, then the connection loses its integrity. It becomes compulsory. It becomes survival, not choice. So if you want to be loved deeply, don't just be there. Be willing not to be there. Let that willingness shape the quality of the bond you build. Because the moment you're ready to walk away, not as a threat, but as an act of self-respect, is the moment you become impossible to forget.